The jungle was silent except for the rain, a soft, steady whisper trickling through the canopy. Somewhere deep within that fading battlefield, a young Japanese nurse trembled in the shadows of the trees. Mud clung to her knees. Blood, not hers, streaked her sleeves. Her breath shook as if every inhale might be her last. She looked at the American soldier standing just a few steps away. Then, with emotion born from terror rather than desire, she reached for the collar of her uniform and pulled it open. Her fingers fumbled, shaking violently, yet she pressed on, slipping the fabric from her shoulders. Her voice cracked into the wet air, thin and broken. She was not seducing him. She was not offering herself out of longing. She was doing the only thing she had been taught would keep her alive. She believed this was the price of survival. For years she had been told that American soldiers were white demons, creatures who lived for violence and fed on the suffering of women. In the final desperate months of 1944 and 1945, Japanese propaganda drilled one message into every heart it touched. If you fall into American hands, you will be violated, dishonored, and discarded. And in that moment, she believed every word of it. If this is the price of survival, she whispered in terror, then so be it. But the American soldier just froze. He didn't move toward her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't even seem to breathe. His eyes widened with a kind of horror she did not understand, not the hunger she feared, but the heartbreak of a man witnessing pain he never intended to cause. He stepped back. "Ma'am, stop. You don't have to do this," he said, voice trembling with disbelief. "Please, put your clothes back on." But to her, his refusal was something far worse than rejection. She had been raised to believe that Americans saw Japanese women as filthy, lesser, unworthy. So when he backed away, her fear metastasized into shame. Tears welled in her eyes. She dropped to her knees, bowing her head again and again, begging him not to kill her. "Please," she wept. "Just let me prove I'm worth keeping alive." Behind her words was more than desperation. It was the echo of a nation's propaganda machine. Government broadcasts, school lessons, military warnings, insisting that no woman should ever fall alive into American hands. Better to die. Better to choose suicide. Better anything than the monster they were told awaited them. But the truth, standing there in an American uniform with rain pooling at his boots, was nothing like the nightmare she had been taught to fear. And this impossible moment between two enemies lost in a jungle neither of them chose, would become a story no one expected. A story not of violence but of humanity. Not of brutality but of mercy. Not of what war demanded, but of what one American soldier chose to rise above. In the darkest of wars, sometimes kindness becomes the most radical act. And if you believe these forgotten stories of courage and humanity deserve to be told, you can help keep them alive. Your support, as simple like a subscription, a share, ensures that more people hear these quiet truths buried beneath the noise of war. Because this is only the beginning. Japan in the final phase of the war was a nation spiraling into desperation, and by 1944-45 the government clung to militarism as if tightening a fist around sand. Every major defeat, Leyte in the Philippines, the blood-soaked ridges of Iwo Jima, the catastrophic losses on Okinawa, pushed the country deeper into a psychology built on fear. What had once been patriotic duty hardened into doctrine, the belief that survival itself was dishonor. Propaganda echoed through streets, schools, and even family homes, telling civilians that surrender was a fate worse than death. Women were taught to take their own lives rather than be captured. Children memorized slogans equating loyalty with self-sacrifice. As one survivor would later recall, fear was more common than truth, and that fear saturated everything. The source of this fear was not simply the violence of war but the stories people were fed about the Americans approaching their shores. For years, Japanese citizens had been shown leaflets and posters portraying U.S. soldiers as monstrous white devils, creatures who would kill indiscriminately and violate any woman they found. School teachers repeated tales of American brutality as though reading bedtime stories in reverse, designed not to comfort but to terrify. Even as resources dwindled and bombs fell across Japanese cities, the propaganda intensified, insisting that American troops would tear you apart, body and soul. To a population already exhausted and traumatized, these warnings didn't feel like exaggeration, they felt like certainty. They shaped the way civilians understood the world and prepared them for what they believed was coming. Yet on the other side of the Pacific stood a very different military culture, one built on democratic values that, while imperfect, placed constraints on behavior even in wartime. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, committing to standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. American soldiers were taught that discipline and humanity were not enemies of combat but parts of their duty. Many came from a society where women were increasingly visible in public life. The Women's Army Corps and the WAVES program had thousands of women serving, demonstrating that equality, though far from reached, was gaining ground. A U.S. officer once explained the mindset simply: a soldier fights, but he never stops being a man with a choice. That idea that individuals still bore moral responsibility shaped how troops understood their mission when landing on islands populated by terrified civilians. The tragedy of the Pacific War was that two worlds collided without understanding each other. On one side, an empire taught its people that death was honorable and surrender shameful, that the enemy was a demonic force descending upon them. On the other, a nation taught its troops that victory should not erase their humanity, that an enemy soldier or civilian could still be a person deserving of rights. Between these worldviews lay a chasm. Every misunderstanding, every rumor, every directive shouted through loudspeakers or printed on leaflets widened that chasm until it became nearly impossible for civilians to believe that the Americans landing on their beaches might spare them. The backdrop of these final months is essential to understand everything that followed. Japan was collapsing militarily, yet its government demanded psychological endurance far beyond the breaking point. American soldiers were advancing island by island, carrying both combat training and the cultural expectations of a democratic society. Civilians were caught between these forces, shaped by years of indoctrination that insisted the enemy represented annihilation. And so when U.S. troops finally met Japanese families hiding in caves or on remote hilltops, they encountered not just frightened individuals but the weight of an entire system that had taught them to fear capture more than death itself. Two worlds, two teachings, and an ocean of fear in between them. She was one of the many young women shaped almost entirely by the world she was born into. A war child in every sense, raised in a small, poor household where rice was stretched thin and hope stretched even thinner. Her parents worked long days, and every evening the radio filled their home with the sharp, confident tone of government broadcasts. She grew up hearing that Japan was surrounded by enemies, that only loyalty and sacrifice could protect the nation. By the time she was a teenager, her school lessons had become less about literature or arithmetic and more about duty, endurance, and the unwavering belief that Americans were merciless creatures waiting beyond the horizon. She believed it because everyone she trusted believed it. Even her kindness was shaped by fear. When she joined the medical corps, she did it because it felt like the only thing she could offer. Many young Japanese women served in logistics and field hospitals, patched into the machinery of war not through weapons but through bandages and whispered encouragement to wounded soldiers. She excelled at calming the dying, at holding their hands when morphine ran out, at offering the illusion of safety in a world collapsing around them. But beneath that tenderness lived something else, a constant readiness to die rather than be taken. That belief was not dramatic to her, it was normal, ingrained. She carried it the way others carried family heirlooms, quietly, unquestioningly, close to the heart. And thousands of miles away, across farmland and rolling plains, a boy was growing up under a different sky. He came from a small town in Kansas, or maybe Iowa, the kind of place where neighbors waved from porches and summers smelled like cut wheat. He wasn't fearless or heroic or any of the things newspapers like to print about soldiers. He was simply someone who answered the call because nearly every young man he knew felt they had to. 70% of American servicemen in World War II came from towns just like his, raised on routines, on Sunday suppers, on a sense that doing the right thing mattered even when no one was watching. His mother wrote letters asking if he was sleeping enough. His father sent him advice about patience, about keeping his temper, about remembering who he was even when the world grew violent. He carried those letters folded in the same pocket where he kept a picture of home. A porch, a dog, a line of trees that always seemed to be leaning into the wind. He carried a rifle but also a heart raised to respect, trained in an army that drilled rules of engagement, that reminded its soldiers repeatedly that prisoners of war were still human beings. No one pretended the fighting was clean, but they were warned that cruelty was a choice, and a dishonorable one. Had life been different, the two of them would never have known the other existed. She would have stayed a quiet daughter in a mountain village. He would have stayed a small-town boy working a predictable job, maybe fixing tractors or delivering milk before dawn. Their destinies traveled on opposite tracks, guided by different textbooks, different fears, different definitions of duty. Yet war does not respect the boundaries of ordinary life. It tears paths through jungles and villages and hearts, forcing strangers into the same moment without warning. And so on a humid afternoon deep in a forest neither of them had ever meant to enter, their worlds abruptly collided. She had been separated from her unit during artillery fire, wandering through trees thick with heat and dread. He had drifted off course while trying to regroup after the chaos of a skirmish. Neither one expected company. Neither one expected the other to appear through the haze of leaves and drifting smoke, equally exhausted, equally alert, equally young. For a breathless instant they simply stared, two people carrying everything their nations had taught them. She saw the monster she had been warned about her entire life. He saw a terrified girl in a torn uniform gripping a medical satchel like a shield. The forest held its breath around them as if waiting to see whether fear or humanity would win. They had no shared language, no shared history, no reason to trust one another. But fate, indifferent and unplanned, had brought them to the same patch of earth. Two lives shaped by opposite stories, crossing in a war that had promised them nothing except loss. And yet in that collision, fragile, trembling, impossible, something else began. She moved before he could speak. 1 second she stood trembling before him, and the next she was pulling at the ties of her uniform with frantic, jerking motions, as if trying to outrun her own terror. The fabric fell from her shoulders in clumsy folds. Her breath came in sharp gasps. For a moment he didn't understand what he was seeing, didn't understand why her hands shook so violently or why her eyes were squeezed shut as though bracing for impact. And then the realization hit him like a physical blow. She thought this was the only way to survive. Somewhere in her mind, shaped by years of warnings and whispered lessons, she believed an American soldier would kill her unless she offered herself first. She had been taught that surrender meant violation, that capture meant certain death. Countless Japanese POWs would later tell interviewers, "We believed the Americans would kill us immediately." She believed it so completely that her body moved faster than her thoughts, driven by the desperate instinct to do anything, to stay alive. "Do what you must, just don't kill me," she whispered, the words shaking as they fell from her lips. He stumbled backward, horrified. His hands shot up as if facing a weapon, his voice cracking as he tried to stop her. He had never seen terror like this, not the sharp fear of combat, but a deeper, more personal dread carved into her bones. "No, no, stop," he said, but she only flinched, misreading his alarm as anger. To her, his panic looked like disgust. And that misunderstanding, so small yet so catastrophic, sent her spiraling further. She thought she had failed to appease him, that he was rejecting her, that she was moments away from being killed. Her voice broke into pleading fragments. Her body curled inward as though bracing for a blow. She begged him to let her prove she was worth keeping alive, convinced that he was evaluating her the way a butcher examines meat. Fear made her words incoherent, a stream of apologies and trembling breaths. He felt trapped in the moment, terrified not of her but of hurting her without meaning to. The rifle across his chest suddenly felt like an accusation. All his training, about discipline, about respecting prisoners, about humanity, felt useless against this depth of misunderstanding. He tried to speak softly, slowly, hands extended, palms open, but she recoiled each time as if unsure whether an open hand meant restraint or mercy. The gulf between them, invisible but immense, widened with every second she misunderstood his intentions. In all his months overseas, nothing had prepared him for this. He had heard stories about civilians hiding, about families refusing to surrender, even about mothers leaping off cliffs during the fighting in Saipan to avoid being captured. But hearing stories was one thing, facing the living truth of those stories was another. Seeing the terror in her face made him realize how completely two nations had been taught to fear each other. To him she was a frightened girl who needed reassurance. To her, he was the embodiment of every nightmare she had ever been told. He kept repeating the only words he could think of, "You're safe. Please stop. You don't have to do this." But language itself betrayed them. She didn't understand the sounds. All she heard was tone, and even that she struggled to interpret. Each time he stepped closer, she froze. Each time he stepped back, she looked more confused. It was as if every gesture meant two different things depending on which world you came from. He had never imagined that the cultural distance between them could be this enormous. That fear could reshape a person's sense of reality so completely. That a young woman raised on propaganda would rather strip herself in the middle of a silent forest than risk the fate she believed awaited her. The weight of it settled into him slowly, a heavy, painful recognition that the war was not just fought with bullets and orders but with stories powerful enough to bend instinct, morality, even self-worth. In that moment, surrounded by trees and dusk and the lingering smell of gunpowder, he realized that the greatest barrier between them wasn't language or uniforms or enemy lines. It was the simple, devastating truth that each of them had been taught a version of the world that made the other impossible to understand. He kept his hands lifted, his voice softer than the wind stirring the leaves above them, trying to reach her through the wall of fear she'd carried her whole life. She was still trembling, still clutching her torn uniform to her chest, eyes darting like a trapped animal waiting for pain. So he slowed everything, his breathing, his posture, even the space between words, hoping gentleness could cross a distance that logic couldn't. He spoke not with authority, but with the quiet urgency of someone trying to save a life in a different way. "You're safe," he murmured again, more slowly this time. "I'm not going to hurt you." She blinked at him, confused, as if the idea itself was something she had never been taught to imagine. He took one small step back to show he meant no harm, and in that space he began offering pieces of a truth she had never heard. He tried to explain, haltingly, carefully, that where he came from, women were not bargaining chips for survival. They were students, factory workers, mothers, friends. They voted. They earned wages. They chose their husbands or chose not to marry at all. "Back home," he said softly, tapping his chest, "women choose their own lives." The words hung in the air between them, unfamiliar and fragile. She stared at him as if he had spoken a language from another planet. Something in her face wavered, just slightly. Not trust, not understanding, but the tiniest crack in the armor built by years of terrifying stories. She didn't lower her guard, but she didn't flinch from his voice anymore. Her breaths came slower, less jagged. Fear still wrapped around her like vines, but something gentle was slipping through. She kept asking, with her eyes more than her voice, how any of what he was saying could possibly be real. How could the enemy she'd been raised to fear speak of women with respect? How could the monster in every leaflet sound like he was trying to protect her? He sensed her disbelief and didn't push. Instead, he let silence settle for a moment. Then he began to tell her about the place he came from, because sometimes the only way to undo a lifetime of fear is to offer the world that shaped you. He told her about the little town where everyone knew everyone's names, where neighbors brought food after storms, where summer nights smelled like fresh soil and cut wheat. He told her about his mother, who worked long hours during the war at a factory building airplane parts, her hands steady and proud. He told her about the fields behind his house where freedom wasn't something soldiers talked about, just something people lived, simple, unforced, stitched into daily life. She listened, still cautious but no longer frozen. Her eyes followed the movement of his hands as he drew invisible scenes in the air. Homes with wide porches. Schools where boys and girls learned together. A life where women could walk freely, speak freely, dream freely. He didn't try to make America sound perfect. He was too honest for that. But he spoke of a principle that ran deeper than politics or uniforms. "Freedom isn't just a word," he said quietly. "It's how we treat each other." And he meant it, not as a slogan, not as a soldier trying to persuade an enemy, but as a human being trying to show her there were other ways to live. The more he spoke, the more her expression shifted. Confusion slowly gave way to something else. Not trust, not yet, but recognition that the world might be bigger than the narrow, frightening space she had been taught to see. She clutched her uniform tighter, pulling it back over her shoulders, not out of shame but because the immediate terror was loosening its grip. For the first time since they met, she dared to look directly into his eyes. What she found there wasn't hunger or cruelty. It was sincerity, solid, steady, disarming in its simplicity. And in that fragile moment of quiet, standing in a forest far from both their homes, she began to understand something she had never been allowed to believe. Sometimes the truth is kinder than the fear you were raised on. She stood there in the quiet of the forest, wrapped in the confusion of everything he had just revealed, and for a long moment nothing moved. Then the weight of it all, the fear she had carried, the story she had believed, the shame of what she thought she had to do to survive, pressed down on her all at once. Her knees weakened. Her breath broke. And before she could stop herself, she sank to the ground and began to cry. It wasn't the panic trembling from earlier. It was something deeper, something that had been locked inside her since childhood. The tears came in uneven waves, shaking her shoulders, spilling through the cracks of a lifetime shaped by terror. She cried for the things she had been told. She cried for the innocence fear had stolen from her. She cried because, for the first time, she was starting to understand that the world might not be as cruel as she had been taught to believe. Shame mixed with relief, and the mixture overwhelmed her until she could no longer hold herself upright. He watched her quietly, unsure whether to step closer or let her find her strength again. In the end, kindness decided for him. He lowered himself slowly, sitting just far enough away to respect her space but close enough so she wouldn't feel alone. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't try to hush her. Sometimes he understood a person needed to cry to finally breathe. When her sobs softened, he spoke with the gentleness of someone who knew she wasn't breaking. She was finally beginning to heal. "You're not wrong," he said softly. "You were never wrong. You were taught to be afraid." His voice stayed steady, each word deliberate, careful not to reopen the wound she had just begun to release. "What you believed wasn't your fault. You were told stories meant to scare you. Stories meant to keep you from ever surrendering." She wiped her eyes with shaking hands, but she didn't look away this time. She listened. He continued, choosing each word with quiet purpose. "You're safe. That's all that matters now." For her, safety had never been a promise, only a distant hope. Yet in his tone, safety didn't sound like something she had to earn. It wasn't a bargain or a condition. It was simply given. He told her he would take her to the American lines, that she would be registered as a prisoner of war, that she would be treated under rules she had never heard of but that every American soldier knew by heart. He explained that she would be given water, medical care, a place to sleep, and time to recover. He explained that no one would hurt her. No one would ask anything of her except her name and her wounds. The more he spoke, the more the forest around them seemed to soften. The same trees that had watched the terror of their first encounter now stood silent witness to something different. Something almost hopeful. She pressed her hand to her chest as if steadying a heart that was learning a new rhythm. And in that stillness she understood the truth of his promise. She was no longer in danger. The person she had feared became the person ensuring she lived through the day. She nodded slowly, a small movement but the strongest one she had made since they met. She wasn't ready to stand yet, but she was ready to believe him, at least enough to let him help her. He rose first, offering a hand without insisting she take it. When she finally placed her trembling fingers into his palm, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of trust beginning to form, fragile but real. For the first time since the war began for her, she felt the faint, unfamiliar warmth of being protected, not by force, not by fear, but by the simple humanity of another person. And in that moment, halfway across the world from everything they knew, the course of both their lives shifted quietly, permanently, towards something neither of them had expected to find in a war. The walk out of the forest felt long, but nothing about it frightened her anymore. By the time they reached the American lines, exhaustion had wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, yet she held her head higher than before. She clung to his presence not out of fear of him but because he was the first person in this war who had shown her something she didn't know she could still feel, a sense of dignity. When they finally reached the perimeter and other soldiers came forward, she stiffened for a moment, old instincts rising. But the man who had guided her simply nodded to her, a quiet reassurance that everything would be all right. And she believed him. Her first days in the POW camp were nothing like what she had braced herself for. She expected shouting, punishment, humiliation. Instead, she was led to a medical tent where a nurse examined her with gentle hands and asked if anything hurt. They gave her water, blankets, and warm food, simple staples, yet she stared at them as though they were impossible luxuries. She waited for conditions to change, for the mask to drop, for the cruelty she'd been promised to finally appear. But every hour that passed brought only more small kindnesses. No one touched her without reason. No one treated her like she was less than human. The guards spoke firmly but never harshly. The doctors tended to her as they would any soldier, American or otherwise. Rules were explained calmly. Procedures were orderly. Her name was taken not as a threat but as a formality. And when she was shown where she would sleep, she stood there silently, unable to comprehend why an enemy would be given safety instead of suffering. It was in those early days that her understanding began to break open, reshaping itself piece by fragile piece. She had been taught that surrender meant dishonor and torment. But here, surrender had given her a chance to live, really live, not just survive the war but experience something she never knew could exist in the world: compassion from the people she was taught to fear most. She watched American soldiers laugh with one another, share cigarettes, write letters home. They were not monsters. They were young men missing their families, tired from battle, yet capable of carrying a sense of fairness even into enemy territory. Every interaction tugged gently at the knot of fear inside her. She began to see small details she had never noticed before: the way the guards held doors open for nurses, the way medics spoke to wounded soldiers with patience, the way no one looked at her with hunger or cruelty. She noticed how freely American women moved around the camp, shoulders straight, voices clear, unafraid of the men beside them. It was the first time she had ever seen women treated as equals by their own army, and the sight alone shook her beliefs to their core. Bit by bit, the stories she had been raised on crumbled. There were no white devils here. No bloodthirsty demons. No men driven by savage impulses. The enemy she had feared all her life was suddenly just people. Flawed, tired, but guided by rules meant to preserve humanity even in the ugliest hours of war. Every meal she ate, every bandage changed, every calm explanation from an American officer became another thread pulling her away from the shadows of propaganda. And when she lay down at night, listening to the distant hum of radios and the quiet murmur of the camp, she realized something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't yet know how to name. Her captors had treated her with more dignity in 3 days than her own country had allowed her in a lifetime. For the first time she wondered, not in fear but in awe, what else about the world had been kept from her. In the quiet routine of camp life, a deeper realization began to settle inside her. What she had experienced in those first days wasn't a momentary gesture of mercy or an exception granted to a helpless prisoner. It was a system. A principle. A code of conduct that every American soldier around her seemed bound to uphold. The Geneva Convention wasn't just a document she had vaguely heard mentioned in whispered rumors. It was living, breathing practice. It shaped how the guards spoke to her, how the doctors treated her injuries, how the officers explained her rights. It shaped the entire world she now lived in. The more she observed, the clearer it became. This was not a trick. Not a facade. Not a calculated performance meant to deceive captured enemies. It was simply how they operated. That truth was devastating in its simplicity. All her life, she had been told that Americans were ruthless, that capture meant torture, that death was preferable to falling into enemy hands. She had swallowed those warnings like medicine, believing them to be the only shield protecting her from peril. But now the shield lay shattered at her feet, for the danger she'd been taught to fear never materialized. Instead, she found kindness, structure, and a measure of respect that challenged everything she understood about war. One afternoon, as she sat beneath the shade of a canvas awning watching medics carry supplies, she felt a surprising calm settle over her. For the first time, she allowed herself to see the truth not as a threat, but as a kind of liberation. If the enemy could be humane, then perhaps the world was not as divided, as poisoned, as she had been raised to believe. Perhaps the boundaries drawn by war were not as unbreakable as they seemed. The thought frightened her. But it also steadied her. She realized then that the humanity she witnessed wasn't meant for her alone. It reflected a broader truth, that the moral strength of a nation lies not in how it treats its allies, but in how it treats its enemies. And here in this camp she saw that principle carried out in countless small acts. Food rationed fairly, medical care offered without bias, guards disciplined for even minor breaches of conduct. It was in these ordinary gestures that the extraordinary revealed itself. This dawning understanding became a quiet pivot inside her, a moment where fear gave way to clarity. The war had filled her with lies because lies were easier to control than informed minds. But once truth reached her, even in the form of something as simple as a warm meal or a respectful gesture, the lies lost their power. As days passed, she began to think about the generations who would come after hers. Young people who might never know the brutality of war but who could still inherit the distortions it produced. She wished they could see what she had seen, that kindness is not weakness, that dignity given to an enemy doesn't diminish one's own, that humanity built into policy is stronger than hatred built into propaganda. She wanted them to understand that war's greatest danger isn't the violence itself, but the way it bends truth until ordinary people can no longer see one another clearly. And she wanted them to learn what she had learned in that unlikely place, that decency, even in conflict, can dismantle the most stubborn falsehoods. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the camp settled into its familiar hum, she found herself whispering a sentence she had heard an American chaplain say earlier that week, words that had stayed with her like a small flame in the dark. Humanity is the quiet victory no bullet can undo. She repeated it softly, letting it soak into her bones. Because she finally understood that this victory wasn't one nation's triumph over another. It was a legacy, one meant for anyone willing to choose truth over fear, compassion over hatred, and dignity over the distortions of war. And she knew, with profound certainty, that it was a legacy worth carrying forward. In the months that followed, she began to live in a way she had never known was possible. Life in the camp was not easy, but it was predictable, fair, and most importantly, humane. For the first time, she could measure her worth not by fear, not by survival, not by the lies she had been taught, but by the simple fact of being a human being. Every day brought small reminders: a warm meal, a shared joke, a careful word from a soldier who had once been her enemy. It was astonishing, almost incomprehensible, how a single act of integrity, one soldier choosing compassion over cruelty, could ripple outward to transform a life so thoroughly. She began to see people clearly again without the filter of terror. She learned to laugh. She learned to speak without flinching. She learned that being alive did not have to mean constant vigilance. And in that slow, patient awakening, she understood something profound. The difference between a life dominated by fear and a life shaped by respect and kindness is immeasurable. A single human act in the midst of war had shattered decades of indoctrination and built, in its place, a foundation she could carry forward forever. Her story, though just one among millions, became a quiet testament to the principle that had saved her. It was a reminder that even in the darkest, most violent hours of human history, morality, dignity, and compassion can prevail. That truth is not abstract. It is lived in the choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And in her case, those choices came from a young American soldier who refused to follow the path of cruelty, who instead chose to honor what was universal in all human beings: the right to live with dignity. In the end, her life was changed forever, not by guns, not by fear, not by propaganda, but by the radical simplicity of humanity extended when it mattered most. And it is a lesson that resonates beyond time or place, a reminder that the true strength of a nation lies not in the force of its weapons, but in the principles that guide its people. Under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest. As we leave this story behind, it is worth pausing to reflect on the quiet power of humanity in the midst of war. The young woman in the forest, shaped by fear and lies, had every reason to expect cruelty, yet she was met with something far rarer: respect. What unfolded between her and that single American soldier was more than an act of mercy. It was a bridge across cultures, a moment where fear and propaganda gave way to understanding. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, compassion can survive, and that it often takes only one person to alter the course of a life forever. History records the battles, the strategies, and the losses, but sometimes the most extraordinary stories are the ones that occur quietly, away from the headlines. It is in these small acts, tending to a wounded prisoner, offering reassurance instead of violence, honoring dignity when it is easiest to discard it, that we see the truest measure of character. This story illustrates that the moral choices made in the chaos of war ripple outward, shattering misconceptions, inspiring empathy, and leaving a legacy that endures long after the fighting stops. While this narrative is dramatized to convey the emotional depth of a single encounter, the principles it highlights are grounded in reality. American soldiers in World War II were trained to respect prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, and countless accounts confirmed that humane treatment, adherence to law, and the protection of non-combatants were genuine pillars of conduct. Acts of decency were not rare exceptions. They were part of a broader framework that demonstrated the United States' commitment to human rights even amid the violence of global conflict. If this story resonates with you, consider carrying its message forward. Take a moment to reflect on the small choices you can make in your own life, how simple acts of respect, kindness, or understanding can reshape someone else's world. Just as a single soldier's humanity transformed one young woman's life, each of us has the potential to make a difference, quietly but profoundly in the lives around us. If you appreciated this story, please like, share, and subscribe to support more content that explores the human side of history. Remember, this tale is dramatized for narrative impact, but the truth it reflects, the courage, compassion, and integrity of American soldiers, is very real. History is full of these moments, waiting to remind us that even in war, humanity endures.